Asian youth who died in their sleep with fear. The story that took place in the late 1970s in the United States of America is not only still a very scary story, but the mysteries surrounding it have never been fully resolved. At that time, the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times suddenly published incredible reports, all of which reported the mysterious death of young Hmong people. The Hmong were people of low race who had fought for the Americans during the Vietnam War, but after the end of the war, they were the target of the brutal purges by the communist government of Laos. Many Hmong were imprisoned and sent to labor camps or sent to death squads during this time of fear. Therefore, many of them fled to America to survive. But apparently their nightmare was never going to end. Long after the first migrations, many Hmong youth died in their sleep without any background. According to the reports and testimony of the families, the victims complained of having terrible nightmares before their death. These nightmares were so terrifying that many victims resisted going to sleep for several days. But finally, when they fell asleep, they suddenly woke up with heartbreaking noises and succumbed to death until their family and friends arrived at their bedside. If this horror story sounds familiar, it's because the late filmmaker was Craven-inspired slasher star Freddy Krueger and the story of A Nightmare on Elm Street 1984, a character who kills his victims in their sleep. He trapped them and sent them to death with cruel methods. There were so many cases of untimely deaths of Hmong youth at that time that it quickly attracted the attention of the media, and there is a wave of concern among the Hmong immigrant community. At that time, about 35,000 Hmong people lived in America. Hmong youth mortality peaked in 1981. In this year, 26 Hmong men succumbed to death. All these victims were young men between the ages of 25 and 44, and all of them had recently immigrated to the United States. The researchers did not find any abnormalities in the autopsies, which is why the press initially dubbed the mysterious phenomenon the Asian death syndrome. Later, this phenomenon was given the non-racial name sudden unexpected death syndrome or Brugada syndrome. Meanwhile, another factor could have caused Hmong men to react more violently to sleep paralysis. The Hmong believed in a form of pantheism in their culture. When they left their motherland, they felt separated from the spirit of their ancestors, a spirit that used to protect them against evil spirits. The Hmong immigrants were afraid that the spirits of their ancestors could not cross the Atlantic Ocean with them and enter the American soil. Therefore, they had no protectors and protect against evil spirits, especially Da Chu. In their motherland, the Hmong used to appease Da Chu by making sacrifices and offerings, but now these rituals were no longer performed. But although Hmong women also had Da Chu's terrible nightmares because of Hmong's patriarchal culture, men always had to answer for Da Chu. The interesting thing about the death of the Hmong is that this horrible phenomenon faded over time, as if Da Chu had taken his revenge for the dishonor and had nothing to do with them anymore. Horror Story 2: Syphilitic Zombies in Renaissance Italy. When most of us think of Renaissance people, we probably think of Italians in fancy dress admiring the works of art by the greats like Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and others. But what is less said about this era, especially in human history, is the plight of syphilis patients. It is true that Renaissance Florence was an ideal place for art, but at the same time, during the first major outbreak of syphilis in 1492, the atmosphere of the Renaissance city was more like a zombie movie. In those pre-antibiotic eras, this venereal disease was less of a secret shame and more of rooting and tearing people's faces off. According to various historical accounts, syphilis caused the flesh of people's faces to be cut off and the person would die within few months. This disease especially caused the complete loss of lips, nose, and in some people, genital organs. For this reason, as can be imagined, seeing the unfortunate survivors of this disease who lost their arms, legs, eyes, and nose due to this deadly disease was not an unexpected image in the streets and passages of that period of Italy. So, if any of the countless Renaissance fairs going on around the world today were really accurate, roughly half the population would look like zombies from The Walking Dead. Although the idea of having a rotting genital organ is unimaginable, the worst part of syphilis is death after only a few months. Thus, the people suffering from this disease after the flesh of their body was eaten even to the bone and was destroyed, and they constantly screamed from the pain, and finally they were dragged to death. Thus, for a brief period during the time of the great masters of the Renaissance, it was probably quite a common occurrence to see figures with their facial flesh completely removed and their skulls exposed. Horror Story 3: The Unfortunate Fate of Franklin's Expedition. 134 people set off on an irreversible journey in May 1845 to find the elusive Northwest Passage. The Northwest Passage was supposed to be a profitable trade route that, on paper at least, connected English waters to all of Asia. Franklin's expedition was one of the best equipped missions of its time. Admiral Sir John Franklin had made several trips to the Arctic, and his ships HMS Terror and HMS Erebus were fully equipped to deal with the ice of this extremely cold region. But as if nothing could prepare him and his men for their heartbreaking fate. In July 1845, Franklin's expedition group completely disappeared. When Sir John Franklin's wife did not hear from her husband until 1848, she asked the Royal Navy to send a search party to the area. Finally, the Kingdom of England sent more than 40 groups to find the crew members of expedition ships to north. Sending every rescue party, Franklin's wife wrote a letter to reach her husband, but none of these letters reached him. It was only in AD 50 that the first evidence of the fate of the Franklin expedition was discovered. 13 ships were sent to the Arctic region in a joint mission between England and America to rescue Franklin and his men, to find any traces of the passengers of the two ships. It was there in an uninhabited area called Beech Island that search and rescue teams found a simple camp and the graves of 3 sailors named John Hartnell, John Trenton, and William Breen. There were no marks on the graves, but it was thought that all 3 graves belonged to 1846. Images of bodies of members of Franklin's expedition along with some of their belongings in the project Destinies, the mystery of Franklin's expedition, held in 2019. 4 years later, John Ray, a Scottish explorer, came across a group of Inuits, Eskimos of Canada and Greenland, in Plea Bay who had some of the belongings of the missing sailors. The Eskimos took Ray and his men to the place where they had found the belongings of Franklin's men. To Ray's surprise, he noticed that some of the bones were broken in half and had knife marks on them, the issue that led him to conclusion that the hungry sailors had turned to cannibalism due to extreme hunger. Then, in 1859, Francis Leopold McClintock's search and rescue team found a note on King William Island that later became known as the Victory Point Note. The note, which is dated April 25, 1848, states that both ships were abandoned at that time. The note added that 15 officers and 90 sailors who survived had gone to Greatfish River the next day. In this note, which was written by Francis Crozier, it was described that after the death of John Franklin, Crozier himself took command of the group. It took almost 140 years to discover more about the fate of Franklin's expedition. By then, it was clear that the mission was effectively a failure after the ships became stuck in the ice in the area. Running out of food and supplies, the desperate group abandoned ship and decided to seek help somewhere in the desolate and uninhabited regions of the north, on the west coast of King William Island. Of course, Franklin's people had no idea of the state of the area and where exactly they were on the map. They just wanted to try their luck. But there were even more chilling details that only came to light in the 1980s. Investigators at the time found signs of malnutrition, lethal amounts of lead, and pneumonia in the bodies of the victims. Thus, it was theorized that the lead poisoning was probably due to poor quality cans. Therefore, it is thought that the increase in lead concentration weakened the body of the ship passengers to the point where they easily died of tuberculosis and pneumonia. While the passengers were found, the ships were to remain lost for nearly 2 more decades. It was in 2014 that the teams of the Canadian Parks Institute discovered Airbus at the depths of 11 meters in the waters of King William Island. In 2016, the Treven ship was found by a team for the Arctic Research Foundation in a bay on King William Island, which was later named Trevor Bay. Surprisingly, neither ship was damaged and the hulls of both ships were completely intact. Apparently, the passengers abandoned the ships when they were sure that the waterway was blocked. After all, we may never know exactly what happened to the crew of Arps and Trevor, but the most important hypothesis is that the members of the groups died one after the other due to various disease and double mental and physical weakness, and while they were half crazy from extreme hunger and despair.